One of the things that we've been tracking closely on this show is the debate over who exactly is involved in the protests and who are the people who are instigating some of the more radical or criminal behavior. Now, on the left, we have talked about how caricaturishly some people have decided this was Russia who was fomenting this unrest. Sorry to break it to you people. We have plenty of our own divisions and outrages in this country without Russia doing a single thing. So wasn't that. There's been discussion about white nationalists. And look, there has been some like fomenting of people trying to create.
It's like Twitter. It's like Twitter stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So Twitter, exactly. So there's that. And then on the right, especially President Trump has been trying to paint the protests as being instigated by Antifa. And, you know, I think we all looked across when this popped up across the country. We're like, Antifa is not that large of an organization. This is kind of ridiculous. The idea that there are outside agitators in mass numbers in every city in the country is kind of ridiculous. But Ken Klippenstein, great friend of the show, of course, has some new reporting. And I want to be clear, this is just about Washington, D.C., but on the same day that Trump decided to designate Antifa a terrorist organization for their alleged involvement in these protests, the FBI found no intelligence indicating Antifa involvement in Washington, D.C. So just an important note of it's very convenient, it's very easy, it's very comforting to imagine that you've got the good protesters who care about the issues and are focused on these issues. Then you've got these few bad ones who are, you know, Antifa or they're white nationalists or they're whatever. The reality is a lot more complex. And Ken's reporting here shows you that, you know, there was a lot of looting. There was a lot of property damage, burned cars, all those things in D.C. And Antifa does not appear to have been involved.
Yeah, it's really an interesting data point. And I think the important context, right, is that it's just the city of Washington, D.C. But you're right, which is that monolithically trying to paint any of the violence in the looting and the rioting as just part of one group or you know, trying to separate it out is just, you know, look, this is a very complex development. I actually happen to think that it doesn't even need to be Antifa or looting. It can just be opportunistic sociopathic criminals. And I think that that is the, you know, probably the most disturbing one in my view, and why I, you know, very much am for a much bigger law enforcement response to that, only that behavior in particular. And it's kind of ignited a bigger conversation, I think, around looting and around rioting and violence. And I was particularly struck because I found this just so unconscionable from Nicole Hannah-Jones, who I've talked about many times. She's the author of the 1619 Project, somebody who I believe very cynically wants to split this country along racial lines so that we don't talk about class, because she firmly believes that we're just a completely racist, irredeemable nation, was justifying some of the violence and the looting that we saw yesterday in an interview. Let's take a listen.
Our protest is only as successful as we can convince white Americans to actually comply with the Constitution and treat Black Americans as full citizens. I think I would not describe looting as violence. Looting is property damage, but it is not violence.
So 1 second before I know that you have some thoughts on that, Krystal. I think that anybody who says that would have to then justify and tell me why it's okay, why former officer David Dorn, who was a captain in the St. Louis police and who was a security guard outside of a pawn shop, was shot dead last night by looters. And I think it's very convenient in order to play act revolution from somebody's home and not have to deal with the very real consequences of business owners getting the just absolutely beaten in the streets with no protection, of people like David Dorn, who was killed in cold blood by these criminals, and by so many others who have been injured in this particular case. And the glorification of violence and of looting, and trying to just say that the looting is only concentrated towards a few, you know, rich luxury brand stores, is just not the case in terms of its application. And I want to stand here and mourn the death of David Dorn, who is somebody who has been whitewashed and not acknowledged by the media. He was a Black man, he was a police veteran, and he was killed doing his job.
And that is actual violence. I mean, that is real violence that absolutely no one should seek to justify. It is unconscionable. It is criminal. The perpetrators should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But on property damage specifically, there's, first of all, no need to glorify it. I do think that there is an attempt by some on the left to make this a sort of just or moral action. I don't think that you need to do that because, as you point out, there are plenty of opportunistic people who just see the breakdown and they want to grab their Nike shoes or whatever they want to get, or they break the windows because it's fun. I mean, there's plenty of just sort of criminal opportunism that's not connected to any cause. However, I would ask the question, who started the looting? And where was the moral outrage over the looting by Congress of the public purse to bail out Wall Street in 2008, to bail out big corporations this time around? Where was the outrage about that looting? Bernie Sanders actually had a great tweet that we can throw up to this regard. The richest foreign Americans sit on $3 trillion, the size of the entire UK economy. Billionaire class pays a lower tax rate than people living paycheck to paycheck. The looting of America has been going on for over 40 years, and the culprits are the ultra rich. And I don't see, this isn't directed at you because I do see it from you, but I don't see the moral hand wringing about that violence, about that looting, which amounts to a much greater threat to America and to regular American citizens than the property destruction by and large that I have seen in this. You know, and we also have to say who started the violence. Wasn't protesters who started the violence. It was police who started the violence. And look, we've talked before about
that's not true. That's not true. The first violence was against Target, and no.
Who murdered George Floyd?
Yes, but in regards to the protests, the violence began whenever they looted the Target and burned down an affordable housing complex and much of Minneapolis. So, look, I think that the conversation around who started looting is fine.
Saagar, hold on a second here, because we've talked about this, and you and I, like, we both see both of the worlds at this point, right? You see the left world, I see the right, like, we see both the split screens. And in the right world, there's a grab every most horrific example of protester violence that you can find, that gets clipped and shared a million times. In the left world, it's the most unconscionable examples, of which there are many, of police violence, of which I count tear gas and rubber bullets. And I'm quite sure that if you were to calculate the number of protesters hospitalized because of police violence, you would come out with much greater numbers. This is not to say that anyone should justify violence from anyone, but I find it very convenient when we only fixate on the worst actors among the protesters. And why do we let the police off the hook? Well, I'll tell you why. Because that violence is normalized and it is justified in our society. That state-sponsored violence is normalized. So let's put out the whole context here. Let's not cherry pick the worst incidents in order to paint all of the protesters in one way or all the cops in one way. Let's be clear about where the looting started, and let's be clear where the violence started.
And I agree. I mean, look, on this show, I think the billionaire class is completely complicit. And they're the ones who have been looting this country for 40 years. I agree completely with that statement. But the answer to looting is not looting itself. And it's not the justification of crime and of looting, and especially like people against David Dorn. And I'd also say if you want to stack up the amount of people with actual bullets inside of them as a result of these violence and rioting, it is police officers across the country who have far more actually inside of them recovering in hospitals, some in the ICU right now. And so if we look in this context and we think about looting and we think about the way that we can structure society, I also find it very strange that a bunch of people, Marxists and Trotskyites, who called out Nicole Hannah-Jones as a tool of the billionaire class in order to cynically divide this country along racial lines, now all find themselves standing in solidarity because they seem to agree with the sentiment that we're an irredeemably racist nation. Why is it that Amazon, Citibank, and all of the cultural elites, people like Nicole Hannah-Jones, are totally on board with these protests and even with much of this violence, because that every single day that we're talking about this, every single day that we're having these riots and we're having this violence and we seem to perpetuate the idea that we are just such a horrific racist nation, which is just not true. This is no country on earth has done more to atone for its racial mistakes than the United States of America. And if you look at all of that in that context and you think about this, then trying to justify looting of people's stores and killing people like David Dorn and beating small businesses because, yes, the billionaire class we should rightfully call them out, is just not, the trying to draw moral equivalence between that or even trying to justify it is ridiculous. The way that the billionaire class was able to loot this country, ship jobs to China and import, mass immigration, the way that they did that is by taking control of the levers of power in America. So that is what productive populist action needs to be.
I don't see anyone calling the National Guard on them. Look, I'm against race reductionism.
I'm
also against class reductionism, because why is it that Black people and brown people are overwhelmingly more likely to be poor, to have little wealth in this nation? And if you look at the police data, which I agree with you, I don't think that this discussion can stay in just policing, because policing exists within a system of cruelty and dehumanization and the breakdown of the rule of law, which was perpetrated long before these protests started to occur. So I agree with you that it has to be a more systemic conversation, that the Amazons of the world and the Bank of Americas of the world would be much less comfortable with. However, I don't think you can ignore the fact that race is still very much alive and well as a major issue, and that anti-Black sentiment is still alive and well as a major issue within society and specifically within the criminal justice system, which is why you see such an overwhelming number of young Black men criminalized over and young brown men criminalized over white people. So I don't think that we can ignore race and class and the way that the two intersect.
Yeah, but if you were to listen to much of their rhetoric, you would think that you would not understand what the actual data is. So here's some of the data. For every 10,000 white Americans who are arrested for a violent crime, 4 are killed. For every 10,000 Black people who are arrested for a violent crime in America, 3 are killed. It's actually lower. If you look at non-white police officers are no less likely to use lethal force against minorities than white officers. And the U.S. incarceration rate in the United States is lower than at any time since 2008 and is lower in the lowest level in 20 years. There are 1/3 fewer Black Americans in American prisons today than there were in 2006. So to say as if the problem has gotten worse since then, and actually the shooting of unarmed people, again, is something that only occurs in 6% of cases. The vast majority of people who are killed by police officers have a gun or a knife on them and are using it at the time. So there is not an epidemic of police violence on this level that we need to talk with actual informed statistics.
You've covered stop and frisk in New York. You've covered in other cities as well that implemented that, and how overwhelmingly who was stopped, Black and brown people. I was looking at, there's so much data on this. And look, I do want to point out, there needs to be a lot more data, and there are a lot fewer studies around the way that poverty is criminalized and the way class intersects with the criminal justice system. And I think that is important. But 20 million traffic stops analyzed in a book called Suspect Citizens, and Blacks are almost twice as likely to be pulled over as white. So it's not just about who gets killed. It is the case that we have had some criminal justice reforms that have moved things in a positive direction. But to your point, I think this is not just about what happened with George Floyd. That was the flashpoint. But the context of millions out of work, the context of the fact that George Floyd was in a position where he would have to pass a counterfeit bill. Why? Because he was out of work, right? That context, people not having health insurance, people not having hope for themselves and for their families and for their children. That's really the piece that we need to talk about.
Yeah, certainly. And we need to turn your light back on. So let's have more. We'll have more.
So we'll break.